I'm very glad that we're talking about renewing globalization and not killing globalization, which is the debate we sometimes hear. My name is Terry Miller. I'm director of the Center for International Trade and Economics at the Heritage Foundation. Before I arrived at Heritage, I worked for 32 years as a U.S. diplomat and had the honor to represent our country, the United States, as our ambassador to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and also as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Global Issues. So that gives you a little idea of where I'm coming from in this discussion. We have a very distinguished panel here, many of whom wrote important essays in this book that you all have available. And I recommend this book to you strongly. The essays, a lot of thought was put into these. They're very concise, they're very wide-ranging, and I think it's well worth anyone's time to read through this book in its entirety. You'll come out with a much better grasp of the overall concept of international economic growth and international economic relations, both the constraints and the possibilities that lie inside of that. Now, we're here to discuss the G20 meeting, and the G20 has an agenda, but I think it's important that we recognize that each leader, each of these 20 leaders that come to this meeting, have their own social and political context, their own economic context. They come from countries that are in different economic situations. They come with different political strengths, sometimes different political systems. They have different pressures on them. Some have a lot more pressure than others in terms of the domestic constraints that follow them around as they go to these meetings around the world. Interestingly enough, there are probably more constraints on the democratic leaders than there are on those that come from more autocratic societies where they don't face domestic political pressures at the same level in some cases. But in any case, I think it's important to remember that when you have 20 leaders coming to a meeting like this, you're not going to have just one agenda, you're going to have 20 agendas. And the challenge in many respects is how do we distill all these various interests and agendas down to one thing, one agenda that everyone can agree on and that can serve as the basis for action moving forward. And is the question actually distillation? It may be rather that we need to synthesize. You'll find in terms of our presenters and some of the written materials that are available to you, there are very different proposals about the best way to move forward. And so it's going to be very thought-provoking, I think. What kind of constraints are there on agreement or on moving forward to renew globalization? Well, there are institutional constraints, and you'll hear some about that. There are political constraints. That's pretty obvious, I think. And there are also psychological constraints for how we can even talk about some of these issues that are so complex in a rational way. Do we need a societal or international consensus, for example, about levels of risk? You're going to hear a lot about risk in the next several days as this meeting goes forward. And you're going to hear a lot about the risks of the market system or the risks that are inherent in the market system. But what you're going to hear from our panelists and also perhaps in some of the discussion is about the risks to the market system. And are there actions that are potentially going to be taken that actually threaten the free enterprise market system and could do harm to that system? Politicians often talk about eliminating risk. I think you've all heard that in the news. Well, economists know that if you eliminate risk, you're also going to eliminate growth and progress. And the question is finding the right balance. You really can eliminate risk in a system, but there is a cost to doing that. And we have to identify what those costs are and then determine how much risk we want to accept in order to achieve the maximum amount of progress. And there are important issues of psychology, of equity involved in this discussion, and hopefully we can get into some of that in greater detail. But the question is, how can we have an intelligent conversation about risk and how to manage risk in the international system and in the economic system? And then another issue that I want to raise, and this is one on which I think you'll find all of your panelists here agreeing, is that one of the biggest threats to the renewal of globalization is the resurgence of protectionism. And this is actually a bigger question. It's presented most often as pressure from labor unions or from firms. But I think the bigger question is, how do we insulate governments from the pressures of privileged groups or elites to maintain the status quo, in which they enjoy existing privileges? When people come and ask for protection, it's never a request for a change. It's a request to keep things the same as they are or as they were in the very recent past. The very concept of protectionism is to protect the status quo and what is already there. And there are a lot of pressures to do that, particularly at a time of accelerated change. And one of the things you heard from our first panel this morning was how the pace of change is accelerating in our societies. And that creates a lot of pressures on people and a lot of pressures on politicians. My idea as a free market economist would be, don't create these situations in the first place. If you give government too much power, allow government to be too intrusive in the marketplace, this creates pressures on businesses to engage in rent-seeking activity where they come and ask for privileges from governments rather than concentrating on how to make their businesses more productive. And of course, the larger government involvement is in economies, also the greater the opportunities and the temptations for corrupt behavior. Now, the solutions to this, they're wide-ranging. I want to give you just a few that came from the writings of the invited participants who are not on our panel, but who did participate in producing this book. And they're all over the block. Robert Hutchings, for example, talks about a grand global bargain that involves actions by the G20 in areas of reform of the financial system, managing anti-globalization backlash, energy security, climate change, nuclear proliferation, and the reform of global institutions. It's virtually the agenda that the G20 have set for themselves. And his idea is that you should have action by the G20 in all of these areas. He talks about President Dwight Eisenhower's old idea that if you meet a problem that you can't deal with, the proper solution is to enlarge the problem so that you bring more people into, more people are involved in dealing with that problem. And so this would be the big government solution, if you will, to the problems that we face. On the other hand, we have some people writing in this book that have very simple solutions. Steve Forbes says, don't worry so much about the institutions, but just create a stable monetary involvement. Steve would do it through returning to the gold standard, actually. He believes if you did that, the markets would be able to work out the issues. By the same token, Stephen Krasner writes that that it's important to remember that things aren't really so bad. We've brought millions of people out of poverty over the last 2 decades. Great power relationships have never been more benign in Steve's view. He talks about the design of aid programs and other interventions so that you promote democratic accountability. Well, maybe this is the way forward for people. We've got Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, who writes that of the importance of governance. Along the same lines, how do leaders retain power? These leaders come here, all 20 of them. For many of them, their primary concern is perhaps the next election, or how do they maintain themselves in power. And any decisions they make or programs they put forward are at least going to have one eye on the question of maintaining themselves in power. And Bruce talks about the difference between countries where you have small groups of elites that have to be satisfied by the government. And that's the case where the government may be the main dispenser of economic largesse or wealth in a society. And he recommends that we try to come up with policies that would broaden the coalitions that support governments and leaders. And so that the government gets out of the business of dispensing favors, both economic and political, to maintain themselves in power. And finally, John Miller has written, and this is just the most important general point that we face, that markets are complex systems with a lot of feedbacks, both positive and negative. And the straightforward kind of scientific reductionism that we in the policy world most often try to use in solving problems, where we try to identify a single cause and effect, that may not be possible or appropriate in the market system because of the complexity of the issues that are involved therein. So again, I recommend the booklet to you. I think you'll find a lot of wisdom therein. I'm now going to turn to the panelists and ask each of them to just in 2 or 3 minutes give us a brief overview of the insights that they bring to this discussion of the constraints that we are facing in maintaining or renewing globalization around the world. And I'd like to start with Kiron Skinner, who, with a couple of collaborators, wrote a very interesting paper about some of the structural issues of these groupings, the G20 and other groupings in which leaders meet and cooperate. Kiron?
Thank you for that introduction. I'm one of the hosts of the conference, and I wanted to take just a second to thank a number of people, but as I wrote the list, it kept growing, and I will risk not mentioning some important people, so I want to thank everyone who helped put this together, both at the Atlantic Council side and Carnegie Mellon, and in particular to thank my department head, John Miller, for allowing me to snatch a large part of the staff of the department without his consent to work on this event. I see them running around. I didn't know that was going to happen today. But I will turn to the main point to give some context of the G20, and my co-authors and I try to think about this meeting in a historical context and in terms of the challenges this ever-growing body faces. I don't know if you know the fact, but the G20 started as the library group in March 1973. The Secretary of the Treasury at the time, George Shultz, recognizing that the economic crisis would deepen in the aftermath of the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. By then, in '73, the world's major currencies were floating against each other. There was an impending oil crisis. The first major OPEC crisis happened later that year. He invited his opposite members from France, Germany, and the UK to meet informally. And President Nixon said, "Why don't you use the basement library of the White House?" They dubbed themselves the Library Group, and it was supposed to be an informal gathering. Within 3 years, it had become the G7 and was holding its second summit. They included Canada, Italy, and Japan to expand the group. And they were issuing communiques, something they had promised themselves they would never do. By the end of the 1990s, the independent state of Russia joined, and it became the G8. As a result of the Asian economic crises of that same period, the G20 was formed to give developing nations an opportunity to interact with the top industrialized nations in a similar forum. So these organizations the G system has expanded far beyond its original intent, which was to be an informal meeting place to talk about ways to coordinate international economic policy. Now the G20 the G20, which grows out of the original library group and is kind of a parallel organization to the G8, addresses economic issues in its official title as an organization focused on central bankers and finance ministers. But leaders have decided to attend. Starting in November of last year, it became a leaders forum. So we now have presidents and prime ministers in addition to finance ministers and central bankers, which means that every issue is on the table now, including political security, climate change, not just issues of economic coordination. In addition to the G8, the G7, which still exists, the G8 with Russia, the G20, which includes, again, developed and developing nations, there's a new G5. I'm a professor. Can anyone here tell me what the new G5 is? Well, there's a new, so the G5, Professor Sylvia Przewódzki, I'm sure knows, includes Mexico, if I get it right, Brazil, India, China, and what's the other? China, India, and Russia. There's a new G5 plus Egypt. Well, I don't know about the G2. So there's so many of these. Well, there's a new G5 in particular that attended the recent G8 meeting in Italy this summer, and it's called the G5 plus Egypt. The G5 plus Egypt is making a case, along with support from some of the G8 members, especially Italy, France, and Germany, to join the G8 to make it the G14. So probably within 2 years, we will have a G14, the old G8, the old G7, the G20. Some are trying to make the G20 the G33. And then some are, in fact, arguing for the G192, which is to expand the G system to the whole membership of the United Nations. The reason I mention all of this in the history is to say that the larger the system grows, the more relevant it actually becomes, because it's an informal body. If you go on the website of all of these entities, and again, that's not what the library group wanted, but they all have their own website, and they issue communiques actually the first day of the summit. If you go on the website, you will see they say that they're informal organizations with no secretariat, no permanent staff, no office building. That sounds a little dangerous at the international level. For all the problems with the UN, there is some accountability there. The problem with this system is that it's growing so large to meet some real demands. And some of the demands are important from the developing world. Mexico and Spain, for example, in terms of GDP, defined in terms of power purchasing parity, exceeds Canada, and China exceeds all of the members of the G20 except the European Union as an entity and the United States. So there is a real case just based on economic power. But if you have a huge informal body that's informal with no real accountability to anyone, making decisions that influence what the real organizations like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO actually do, then it leads to confusion and mission creep and a lot of things. It's hard for states to know exactly what to do and who their real allies are on a given issue. Also, many states have overlapping memberships. Everyone's in the UN, of course, but some members of these various Gs that I've just mentioned and other new organizations such as the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But they're addressing the same issues. So you have states that are literally in 2 or 3 international organizations addressing the same issues, but coming down on different sides of the same problems. So it's somewhat of a confusing situation in which we find ourselves internationally, trying to respond to the aspirations of the developing world and to the fact that for too long during the Cold War, a handful of states, like the Library Group, dictated to the rest of the world what international economic policy should be. I'm a professor, so I don't have to have a solution. I can just identify a problem. So I've identified, I think, what is a major challenge of these organizations. I think it's useful to have conversations, but that's ultimately all that they may actually be able to achieve. Because decision making in an informal structure where the decisions actually have to be deployed within more traditional institutions is a formula, I think, for not getting very much done. There's a lot more I could say about the political divisions within the G20 this week on issues of Iran, Afghanistan, on climate change, some of the most important issues facing the world now. There's deep disagreement in New York going on all of these, in particular because the U.S. is in a major reevaluation of its policies on each of these issues. In Afghanistan in particular, the Obama administration may have its second turnaround on Afghanistan in 6 months. That does not provide the context for great leadership. But I'm going to turn the mic over to some of my other colleagues, and in Q&A we can go into deeper discussion.
Thank you, Karen. It's obvious that there's a tension that she's identified between inclusiveness, bringing the greatest number of countries or people into the discussions on these very important issues and into the process of managing them to the extent we want to do that internationally. There's a tension between that and the efficiency and the difficulties in achieving consensus that you get with ever larger groupings of countries. I'd like to turn now to John Herman on our panel, who has some very direct hands-on experience in helping the U.S. government prepare for G20 meetings and some of the problems that you have in going beyond rhetoric and turning things into actual action that can achieve results in the world. John?
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Again, my name is John Herman. I'm with the law firm of Kelley Drye and Warren in Washington, D.C. And as Terry mentioned, I served at the end of the Bush administration and into the first few months of the Obama administration, and was involved in the preparations for the November summit in Washington that President Bush hosted, as well as in President Obama's preparations for the London summit in April. I guess just to start the ball rolling, just one quick point I'll make about the topic of our panel today of renewing or reinvigorating globalism is what a tough environment it is right now that leaders are facing. With the uncertainty created by the financial crisis and the subsequent slowing of the global economy, it's a very, very difficult sell in many countries to advance trade and investment liberalization. So I think you will see that. You'll see general comments by leaders, and I think, as Kiron was suggesting, what is really important now is moving beyond the general statements to commitments. So in terms of why we're all here today, the G20, there was a fair amount of thought given to the leaders that President Bush just ultimately decided to invite to Washington last November. One of the key considerations was looking for an existing grouping so that you had a clearly defined set of countries and leaders that would be included in the meeting. And based on the work of the G20 and the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, and based on the composition of that group, a decision was made that the G20 would be an appropriate basis for moving forward. I think people went into the G20 summit very aware of the difficulties that would be associated with building consensus, where you had basically moved from largely what was a group of industrialized democracies in the G7 and G8 into a G20, which had a much, much different composition. And I think you, over the course of the last two summits, you've seen some of those disagreements surface. None have been really inhibited progress, but you've seen comments by leaders in the press leading up to the various summits. For instance, disagreements over the importance or necessity of domestic stimulus in the lead up to the London summit in April, with the United States and the UK and China all having come forward with significant stimulus programs the French and the Germans and some others perhaps questioning the necessity of going forward with programs that were as large as a percentage of GDP as some of the other nations. You've also seen disagreements on the scope of financial regulation and reform. How aggressive should national and potentially international regulators be? And a final one that I'll mention quickly is participation. One of the significant outcomes in the London summit was a reinvigoration of funds for the International Monetary Fund and commitments on quota reform. It's widely thought that when those reforms are in place, they will lead to increased representation for the emerging major developing countries and will result in diminished participation potentially by a number of European countries. So you've got the tension there with a larger pool. In terms of the summit this week and the significance of the G20 going forward, I think what will be significant is how the G20 transitions from what up till now has been a very large focus on responding to the financial crisis and the threat to growth to what comes next, what comes after the crisis has passed. Obviously, you've seen talk about imbalances from many senior officials in the Obama administration. I think that potentially could lead to a transition to other issues, climate change, food security. I think it's important to remember that at the summit this week, the G20 will have met at the leader level 3 times in less than a year. You know, November last year, April of this year, and September of this year. Normally within that span, you would have one G8 meeting. And I think the need to put together an agenda on a very short time basis has prevented perhaps some wider thinking and engagement within the G20 on some of these issues. And hopefully we'll see that in the time to come. I guess just one last point I'll make is talking about the proliferation of Gs and whether the G20 will become the new G8 and perhaps supplant some of this. That too will be interesting to see. I've seen some reports in the press that there's already some discussion about perhaps having Canada host the next G20 leaders meeting early next year, that the Koreans in their capacity as the chair of the G20 next year would be engaged in some of the preparations. So it will be very interesting to see if the G20 does in fact supplant the G8.
Thank you very much, John. Now we're going to take the discussion in a slightly different direction. Our next 2 panelists have looked at specific issues. They're broad issues, they're very important issues. One is the financial crisis, the other is climate change. And have them give us a brief discussion of how these various constraints are impacting on their particular issues and how the leaders might look to overcome them. Let's start with the financial crisis and Mansoor Dailami.
Well, thank you very much. I come from the World Bank, and so far at least the World Bank doesn't have the designation of Gs. And if I would look to alphabetic game to find 2 letters, I would say U and D. U stands for universalism because the bank has memberships of all countries, 186 countries, and D for the mission of the bank, which is development and poverty reduction. In terms of the comments, I like to highlight 3 issues, which I think is very important, particularly as we look beyond the current crisis and the kind of uptick in the global growth that we see. First one, in my position, I've been monitoring these markets over the past 2 years. I'm kind of coming out of this crisis a little bit more optimistic than many people have taken. I recall very well during the period of September 2008 through March 2009, when we saw the world economy virtually falling. Many countries either in deep recession or moving toward recession. We saw markets, equity markets, bond markets, trading on panic rather than fundamentals. We saw unemployment rising. And we saw obviously great concern expressed by commentators, by leaders of different countries. And that really affected more than anything else the confidence. The confidence of consumers, the confidence of investors. And when you have a confidence problem, then you have a serious problem. It goes beyond economic and social development. And in fact, part of the reason that this crisis was so deep, was so severe, compared to previous crises that we have a long history, was because confidence was so shattered this time around. People lost confidence in the institution. People lost confidence in the whole structure of global finance. And I think one of the key challenges moving forward is really how to restore confidence of the public at large in the overall governance of financial markets and economic system. The second point which I like to make is that looking again on the economic scene, yes, we do see positive developments. We see recovery is picking up in Asia particularly. We see signs of growth in the United States and other European countries. And we see industrial production, exports picking up some steam. But when you look at the long-term development consequences of this crisis, this is something that is going to be with us for many years to go. And G20 so far has been more or less representative of middle-income countries and industrial countries. And the perspective that I think the bank is putting in this agenda of the G20 this time around is the poorest countries, is the low-income countries. Historically, whenever we see a global shocks, economic shocks, whether they are from outside or from the developing countries themselves, the poverty is affected very severely. This time around, we are estimating close to maybe 89 million people more could be added to that abject poverty. It's very important when you look at the human aspects of this crisis. It's really the governments, particularly in the poor countries, that they don't have the resources, they don't have the kind of macroeconomic counter fiscal balances. They generally tend to cut expenditure, which is very fundamental to development. They cut educational expenditure, they cut health education, they cut social safety net education. And these are the ones that has much longer term implications. We have, for instance, seen that generally malnutrition among girls become much more severe than the boys. It's not because the girls biologically weaker than the boys. In fact, the girls tend to be stronger than the boys in many countries. But it's just because families try to protect the boys vis-a-vis the girls. We see, for instance, poverty indices in the East Asia crisis. It took another 10 years that they could reach the level before the crisis. I think that is a very important part of the agenda that has to be put in the table. We estimate close to countries may cut $12 billion out of those social and core indicators. And that's why our President Bob Zoellick has been calling for a responsible globalization, for a sustainable globalization. I think the economic fundamental forces in play are going to make globalized a reality, whether we like it or not. The question is not the forces of economic that's pushing us to globalization. It's to extent to which we have choices, we have policy instruments that we can change the form of it, the nature of it, that become a responsible globalization. The third issue that Kiron mentioned, the question of the Gs, and in fact, actually going back a little bit more, there were G77, the so-called non-aligned nations. And during the crisis, people talk about G2, China and United States as the two countries that had the economic muscle to pull the global economy. But somehow we have to come with some grips with this G equation, with G business. I mean, after all, the whole international system today is going under significant, what I call a shift in economic balance. We are moving away from the basically industrial countries towards more developing countries. In terms of economic power, in terms of economic resources, in terms of, if you look at the population, demographic factors, they're all signal that much more stronger role for developing countries. And the question is, how best can we accommodate that? How best we can manage this transition? A couple of papers, and I myself and other colleagues have been writing. We have been talking about a multipolar world economic system. That's basically, we are moving away from one or two pole economics, maybe multiplicity of poles. One pole could be, for instance, the BRICS countries that today are becoming very important. China could be, maybe some of the oil exporting countries in some combination. But the key question is that as you go towards much more multiplicity of economic powers, economic systems, then it's going to pose a major problem for the whole establishment, for the whole system, how best we can manage it. In the monetary area, over the past couple of months, we have seen that probably whenever the Chinese official talks about moving away from the US dollars, diversifying the investment in other currencies, markets the next day is affected quite importantly, and with good reason. China today is the largest creditor of the United States government. Today holds the largest amount of US government debt. And obviously, whenever they decide, talk about this affect markets. But at the same time, the United States is the largest market for Chinese exports. Therefore, there's a commonality of interest which binds these two countries together. You could look at this commonality interest in the broader sense. And I think all of that brings to picture is the connectedness that we see the world economy. But what is really important moving forward, how we make this, is not so much as Terry mentioned, killing the globalization. I think this is beyond our power anyway. There are strong forces that are moving us, making this globalization a sensible and a responsible one. Thank you. I may stop here.
Thank you, Mansoor. Thank you very much. I'm particularly interested in your comments about investor confidence because economists all know that expectations have a way of becoming self-fulfilling in terms of economic activity, and I'm afraid it's no coincidence that the onset of this financial crisis coincided with an election season, a very long election season in the United States, in which the American public, at least, were bombarded with negative messages about both the government of the United States and even the system, the economic system of the United States, and ultimately the electorate seemed to lose confidence in both. And that coincided precisely with the onset of this recession. But now I want to turn on the same theme, particularly talking about some of the psychological factors that impinge on the leaders and the decision-making process, and ask George Loewenstein to talk to us a little bit about global warming and his research in those areas.
Thank you. Let me, before I begin my comments, say that I would say that the onset of the economic difficulties preceded the election season by quite a bit. But in any case, in my essay, I talk about the applications of behavioral economics to global climate change. Behavioral economics is itself a field that examines implications of psychology to economics. Now, I think that behavioral economics has a lot of insights to offer in terms of helping to explain the problem of global climate change. There's a lot of psychology there. The part of the problem is that the consequences of our behavior are delayed. The consequences of our behavior are amorphous. Our behavior, when anything that we do is a drop in the bucket, and we generally have problems dealing with drop in the bucket type behaviors, like, for example, one potato chip isn't going to make us fat, and driving to work one extra time isn't going to affect the global climate change problem. So I think behavioral economics, as well as economics itself, has a lot of implications to offer for understanding why global climate change is such a difficult problem to deal with. If there's one main insight that it has to offer, however, I believe it has to do with something called the self-serving bias. And the self-serving bias is the idea that we tend to confuse what's in our self-interest with what's fair. So if you ask, for example, if you go to a couple, a married couple, they don't have to be married, living together, and you ask them what percentage of the housework, ask each member of the household, what percentage of the housework do you do? The number adds to much more than 100%. People tend to see things from their own perspective. There's a really nice experiment done years ago by Roth and Murnaghan. They took two people and they said, here are 20 tokens, and one of these tokens is going to win a prize. Your task is to divide these tokens between the two of you. And if you can divide the tokens between the two of you, then we'll hold a lottery and one of you will get the prize. The rub was that for one person, the prize was $5, and for the other person, the prize was $20. Now, think about it from the perspective of the person who's going to win $20. What's the natural way to divide the tokens? Well, the natural way is each of us should get 10 tokens, right? Isn't that what's fair? Divide the tokens equally. Well, the person who was going to get $5 if they won the lottery said the natural way to divide the tokens is that we each have an expected value of winning. So I should get a lot more tokens to equalize our expected value of winning. And so it was this difference between the two parties that made it very difficult for them to settle this very simple negotiation. And I think this is a metaphor for climate change. If people have a hard time solving that problem with all they have to do is split tokens and there's two prizes, think about the difficulty of trying to decide on emission caps for different countries of the world. So China is going to say, you know, we're growing, but we're still poor, and U.S., you've been polluting for years and years. It's part of the reason why you're so rich. Why should we limit our emissions at all? It's our turn. You should do all of the work of limiting emissions. And the U.S. is going to say, forget it. You know, we're not coming to the table unless everybody limits emissions. And so these self-serving biases are probably the number one impediment to solving the problem of global climate change. Now, at the same time, however, that the self-serving bias, it may be the main impediment to solving global climate change, it also may offer the main solution. And here's the reason. When people view things in self-serving terms, they tend to think that their perspective is the neutral perspective that would be shared by a third party. So the person who's getting $5 would think that anybody would say it's fair to equalize expected values. The person who is getting $20 would say anyone would say it's fair to split the chips, 10 chips for each person. And the result of that is because people think that their perspective on fairness is going to be shared, it's going to make them more willing to accept outside arbitration, because people or nations are going to think that arbitrators are going to side with them. So I believe that the main problem of a self-serving bias, the main problem involving climate change is the self-serving bias, but it also offers the solution, which is the self-serving bias is likely to make people open to the idea of kind of kicking the problem upstairs to some kind of neutral arbitrator.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. In fact, I found your paper to be one of the most interesting in the book. And one of the things that it emphasized for me was just the importance of trying to, for all of us, to try to expand our perspectives to the greatest possible extent so that we understand the biases and the needs of others and can try to incorporate those into any of the solutions that we propose to any of these pressing problems. So now we're going to make this even more particular. We started out with the structural issues, then we looked at a couple of particular political or economic issues, and now I want to take a brief look at a couple of specific countries. And to do that, let's start with Stephen Brockmann, who has some views about Germany in the current crisis.
Before I'm a professor of German here at Carnegie Mellon University in the Department of Modern Languages. And I work primarily on 20th century German cultural history. And my essay in the book is about Germany. But before I talk about Germany specifically, I just want to say that I very much agree with Mansoor about the need for global cooperation. I think it's increasingly clear that there are all sorts of problems that the world is facing today that one country simply can't, even a country as powerful as the United States, simply can't address alone. And coming out of what you were saying also, George, I think this question of the tokens and how do you solve, it's all about cooperation, I think. And so I think it's really good, actually, that the G20 process exists. I think it's great that the leaders are coming and getting together to meet. I think it would be actually quite bad if in a situation like the one that we're facing, they were not getting together to talk about things. So we can't do it alone. We need to work together. We need to cooperate. Another point that I want to make is that we can't do everything. And this is a truism, but politics is always the art of the possible. And so you have to set priorities, and that means that you can do some things, and that there are other things that realistically you can't do. A third point I want to make is, and this is a very important point that we often forget when we're talking about politics and economics, is that culture matters. About 12, 13 years ago, an important political scientist at Harvard named Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations. This book was an important analysis of the world situation in the 1990s after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War system. And you can argue about many of the points that Huntington makes in that book, but one of the important points that he makes is that culture matters. There are various established cultures around the world, and we need to be sensitive to those cultures and to the particularity of those cultures. And that involves religion, that involves history, that involves a whole lot of things. And we should be thinking about that as we face the G20 process. Another point I want to make before talking about Germany is that reality matters. There was a person in the Bush administration a few years ago who said that because the United States is so powerful, we can kind of create our own reality. That's not true. Reality matters, and we have to confront it, all right? We can't just create our own. Obviously, we can have an impact on reality, but we don't create reality. And then the final point I want to make is that history matters. It's very helpful in looking at all these issues to have some sense of historical perspective. In thinking about the global crisis now, the economic situation, it's very important to know about what happened before. This is not the first time that capitalism has faced a crisis. I'm sure it won't be the last. And so it's important in addressing these issues to have some knowledge of that. And then to move into the question of Germany, the final point I want to make is that allies matter. And Germany has been an ally of the United States now for 60 years. The Federal Republic of Germany was founded out of the ruins of World War II, horrible, catastrophic history that Germany really brought upon itself. And amazingly enough, and this is a history that we Americans, I think, can truly be proud of, the Federal Republic really sort of pulled itself up with our help and established itself as one of the most important, powerful economies and countries in the world. And this is something that the Germans can be proud of. It's also something that I think we Americans can really be proud of, and that is a history that we need to keep in mind. When I make the point that culture matters, one of the things that happened in Germany is that you had this country that really had not known a successful democracy, and that we, as the United States, helped that democracy to come into being. That democracy is now celebrating its 60th anniversary. And so I think it's important for us Americans, when we look out there at the world and think about what our cultural values are and the kinds of things that we want to accomplish, that we particularly look at our European allies, and in particularly look at a country like Germany, the world's fourth largest economy, and a country that over the past decade or so has really developed a fair amount of goodwill in the world. And I think Germany, in many ways, is a natural ally for us. One point that I'll make, final point about Germany, somebody mentioned the fact that a lot of these leaders are going to be facing elections. And literally, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, is facing an election on Sunday. So when she leaves Pittsburgh to fly back to Germany, it's basically going to be one final day of campaigning, and then she's up for re-election. Chances are that she will win re-election.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. Picking up on your history point, I think our next presenter, Dworkin y Méndez, will talk to us a little bit about a historical anomaly and perhaps the importance as we move forward of fixing, or at least not repeating, some of the mistakes of the past in some remarks about Cuba.
Thank you. I am also a professor of Hispanic Studies in the Department of Modern Languages, and I'm very grateful to be here. I think, yes, history lessons are important, and one thing that I need to say about Cuba and the United States is that people don't realize that the shared history of our two countries did not begin 47 or 50 years ago, or even 100 years ago, but rather that our connection with Cuba goes back even to the period of the American Revolution. And the United States, once it was formed, had a regular presence in Cuba, as did Cubans in the United States. But getting to the point of the last 47 or 50 years of policy that the United States has maintained with some changes towards Cuba, and given the opportunity to discuss a topic that I don't usually mention very much, which is economics and policy, because I'm more of a student of culture and history, I felt it was a great opportunity to examine a good reason why the United States needs to rethink its policy towards Cuba and needs to find ways to re-engage with Cuba in a sensible and non-confrontational manner. And in the context of the meetings of the G20, and by the way, Cuba is not a member of any of those G groupings that you've mentioned, I think that the countries of the European Union and the other members of the G20 are in an excellent position to provide solid, varied models by which the United States can engage economically with Cuba, which is probably going to bring about greater change in Cuba than any of the policies that have been followed thus far by our government. Curiously, though, even though we've had an embargo, an actual Trading with the Enemy Act, which has prohibited the United States from officially doing business with Cuba, it turns out that the private sector in the United States has been doing business with Cuba, and that as we speak, there are companies in Pennsylvania and in Florida and in Idaho and in many other states of the Union that currently do business with Cuba, which I think is an enormous contradiction given the fact that the government still has an official policy that prohibits that. And the other thing is to highlight the fact that actually the policy that the United States has maintained over the last 47 or 50 years is something that was designed to isolate a government, a regime, but the lasting effects of that isolation have affected the Cuban people much more than it has the Cuban state. And I think that this human sense of responsibility is something that is applicable here. It turns out that there's very little information available to the American public about what goes on in Cuba, and in particular, what economic benefits the United States might reap by engaging with Cuba economically. Of course, the natural tendency is to think about tourism, and it's certainly true, and I wrote about it in my essay, not the millions, but perhaps billions of dollars that a tourist industry, an open tourist industry to Cuba would generate for the United States. It would generate at least 12,000 jobs in the United States right off the bat. And there are many travel companies all around the world that are already engaging in this in Spain, in Italy, Canada, and so on. And the United States is going to be, is not going to be a primary player when it even attempts to initiate these relations, but certainly should have a place at that table. Another thing that people don't realize, due to this lack of information, is that actually these two countries have been collaborating on certain issues over the decades, despite the official and public lack of negotiation or of even conversation. One of them has been related to the weather. And the fact is that the US and Cuba have been engaged in a very close working relationship for probably going back to the 70s through the National Hurricane Center. And Cuba is a country that has an enormous amount of experience in dealing with this type of weather phenomenon, and also in avoiding loss of life and property, and also in recovering from such disasters. And most people would say that, knowing that the U.S. could learn lessons on how to deal with these disasters, which occur every year, every summer. Another thing that people don't realize is that even recently, the U.S. and Cuba have been meeting face to face to normalize mail service between the two countries. This is not something that gets press. Things that get press have to do with groupings in Miami, or with whether Fidel or Raul are really actually in control of the government there. But people don't realize things like the collaboration that does exist between the two countries, or the fact that legislation has been pending in Congress again that would lift the ban on all U.S. citizens being able to travel to Cuba, not just Cuban Americans. There have been recent changes under the Obama administration that have relaxed the impact of the travel ban on Cuban American families and Cuban families on the island, because now Cuban Americans are able to send more money and send more goods. But what we don't know, for example, is that companies like Dish Network have just applied with the FCC trying to get permission to broadcast into Cuba. Or that there was a recent business deal that took millions of American-made cell phones into Cuba to facilitate communication between Cuban American families and Cuban families on the island. Once a year, people are reminded that the United Nations General Assembly votes on its opinion of the U.S. embargo of the United States, and for 17 years it has voted negatively and feels that the U.S. needs to change its policy for many reasons, not just economic reasons. And the U.S. Council of Bishops was recently in Cuba and is quoted as saying that the U.S. and Cuba need to listen to better angels, because 50 years of hostilities have gotten us a lot of pain and suffering, but not much else. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that Cuba has recently is trying to negotiate a commercial license with 18 private firms in the U.S. because Cuba produces a great deal of biomedical products, important products. Recently, this particular effort concerns a medication called Herrmann, which has drastically reduced the need for amputations in diabetes patients. Cuba has one of the lowest HIV infection rates, and whereas earlier on followed the protocol followed by most developed countries because it found it difficult to get interferons and so on produced in the United States, became very entrepreneurial and started developing its own antiretrovirals and interferons, which are now on the market in at least 40 countries. Biotech is actually a very big field, and biomedical is a very big field in Cuba. These products are sold, as I said, in over 40 countries, and there are at least 180 of these products, and at least 1,300 applications have been patented for Cuba in different nations. So this economic miracle that could occur if the U.S. were to engage with Cuba economically, which would bring about tremendous development for both countries, and also mend the lives of millions of people on both sides of the straits, would be a reflection of a truly global view of engaging economically with countries all around the world. And so that's basically what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate that perspective. And It certainly gives us a vivid understanding of the political constraints on an issue that any leader may face, and certainly the U.S. administration of any party faces a lot of political constraints in terms of how to deal with Cuba. Now, last but not least, we have a real privilege of having a unique perspective on our panel. Erika Mann has a wide and varied background and brings a lot to the discussion, but I'd like to focus most on her background as a member of the European Parliament, and as a politician herself, she is able to bring a perspective to what's going on in these discussions. And I would ask her to give us some insight as to how the politicians that are meeting here this week can get a handle on all these issues and move forward in a constructive way into the future. Erika?
Thank you so much. I was a member to the European Parliament for 15 years. I'm from Germany, and I was the speaker for my political group, Social Democratic Family, on trade. I think what is interesting to observe is, I think it's really a phenomenon which is, I think, goes much beyond that what we do understand right now. Because what we see, it's only, an observation, when leaders meet and how they sit together and how they discuss policy issues. But what is, of course, much more important and much more relevant is to understand is what is behind it, what is driving them. Why actually do we suddenly have a G20? And what is occurring? What is changing in the world context? And I mean, being around and covering trade for so many years, I have seen this having something similar actually in the World Trade Round, because I mean, the first round which I experienced, it was a round primarily undertaken by the industrialized world. Of course, the developing countries, they were sitting on the table, and on certain issues, they were debating certain topics. But it was a different world. And now, if you see, I mean, we started years ago the latest World Trade Round, and we continue the Doha Development Round. We continue to negotiate. And if you see why, and if you ask yourself why is this the case, the answer is very simple: because you have so much more interest from developing countries in certain issues, and they like to develop and define their own destiny. They're not interested any longer that much that their interest is expressed by others, but they like actually to understand what is important and what is relevant for their own country and for their own nation state and for their own citizens. And not everything is obvious. Many things are unclear. So it is not the case that for most of the political leaders, neither in India or in Europe, I mean, it's not a developing country, you just take it as an example, or in Africa or in China, it is obvious, what is right or what is wrong. Is it better to integrate an agriculture market, or is it more important actually to work on food security in your own country? Is it better to buy into land into Africa like China is doing, because they foresee that in the future there will be not enough food production in their own country if they don't buy land right now in Africa? Or is it better to go into GMO production? Or is it better to go for organic? Or is it better to, like India is arguing in certain cases, that you need traditional production? And so there are many answers. And the same what is true for us and what is true for most of us, it's true for political leaders. You have to find the answer. But how to find the answer, it is very complicated. And it's a very complicated world we are living in. Because if you have 6 members on a family, or you have 20 members on a family on a table, or 80 members in a family on a table, it changes the dynamic. And it gives you have more questions and you have more answers. And it becomes less obvious what you want to do and what you want to achieve. And this is the difficulties. And of course you have more trends as well. You have not a single trend. And because of the internet and because of the interconnection and the interrelationship we are all living in and we are all embracing, one single answer which you think one day it's the best one, the next, you read an article or you somebody tells you, hey, by the way, I found some other research which is telling the opposite. So you sit there again on the table and say, okay, what's right, what is wrong? Now, I think the most important is, and this is what I see, that finally we allow this to happen, because it was very difficult over the last years. It was difficult and still is sometimes in the World Trade talks, and it's true in G20, because there's a lot of resistance, who is actually the most capable of giving the best and the most capable and most intelligent and most sophisticated answer. And I think it will be important in all of those international arrangements and environments finally to accept that there might be not a single answer. There might be maybe many answers. There might be probably not a single most perfect one for the financial crisis and for the outcome of the financial crisis. If you evaluate, there are certain aspects which need to be aligned and which need to be coherent, but the answer might be a little bit different in India than in the United States or in Latin America, because the markets are a bit different, the markets integration is different, the neighbors are different, the markets opening, it's not always the same. So I think this probably would be something important to look what we have, what kind of similarities we have, where we need to find common answers, and where we can allow a differentiation, because the differentiations might provide, relevant information and prevention of future crises as well. I'm very hopeful, I must say. I think the trend for integration continues, and usually it is always the case if you look back into history. It's always first the economy which integrates, then you will see citizens follow, and then the last which will follow the trends usually are the politicians. It is true, so I'm very hopeful. I would be surprised if this trend will not continue and we will not see that politicians will finally start working together, understanding how important it is, because let's face it, if they will be not capable of providing common answers and looking into some kind of crisis control, not perfect control, but some kind of understanding how a crisis can be managed, what to learn from it. Is it foreseeable? How can they discuss failure? What can one learn from failures, etc., etc. Then I think if this is not going to happen, but I'm very hopeful this is going to happen. So it's to work on a negative scenario doesn't make any sense, because I'm truly certain we will see more cooperation in the future, and more willingness in global leaders to actually to follow and to make it workable, that they will actually define their agenda. I'm pretty certain this is true for food security. It will be true for the climate change debate. It will be not perfect what comes out of it, and we shouldn't look for perfect solution. It's not important. The path is important, the right way, the right course is important, not the perfectness in a single answer or in a single meeting or in a single outcome. It is not important. So I'm very positive, and I would be very surprised if we will not see something relevant coming out of the G20 meeting.
Thank you very much, Erika. I started out talking about 20 leaders with 20 different agendas, and Erika wraps up talking about the multiplicity of solutions that may be possible to these problems around the world. But in all this varied information that you've heard here today, and I hope we've challenged some of your assumptions and perhaps opened your eyes to some different ways of looking at issues, I'd like to see if there's at least one thing on which all of our panelists can, in fact, agree. And I would posit that every single person on this panel believes that one of the outcomes of the G20 meeting needs to be a strong statement by the leaders rejecting protectionism. And I would wonder if anybody disagrees with that up here.
I would hope that it would include...
George, go ahead.
If there is such a move, I would hope that it would include an end to agricultural subsidies.
Yeah. Certainly a form of protectionism, absolutely. So there's one thing at least that all of us agree on. We've got about 3-4 minutes left. If anyone in the audience has something they want to contribute or a question that you want to ask. I understand that we don't have the microphone anymore, but I think it's a small enough room that you can be heard. Yes, sir, back there. Yes.
I was fascinated by your framing of climate change as a psychological issue, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what you meant. And I also wanted to sort of push the panel to think about what happens when certain leaders think something is real, a real issue, and others think it's a psychological or a kind of mind, perception issue.
George, you want to start there?
It's not that I think it's not that I think that the problem itself is a psychological issue. I think the problem is very real, but there are a lot of psychological impediments to dealing with the problem. The effects of anything, the consequences of global climate change are delayed, and we generally tend to not be very good at dealing with problems where the costs are delayed, and where there are immediate costs for delayed benefits, or the costs of failing to take action are delayed. As I said, the impact of any behavior that we do is likely to be minimal. That's the drop in the bucket effect. So there's a lot of psychological reasons why this problem is so difficult to solve. I personally think that the self-serving bias may be the number one reason, but there are a lot of other reasons, and that was the point I was making. So we need to, if we want to try to think of solutions to the problem, we need to take into account the same psychology which is contributing to the problem itself.
Karen.
So on the issue of climate change, in addition to psychological bias issues that George has mentioned, there's some real financial issues at stake for nations. So if you followed yesterday's climate change meeting with the United Nations, there was a lot of discussion and proclamations by all nations of their commitment to reduce greenhouse emissions so that there won't be a rise in temperature beyond 2 degrees Celsius in the next 50 years. But then in detail, there was no real commitment from those states to the kinds of domestic policies that would be necessary to make that happen. One, there's a domestic audience cost. Leaders are facing elections. People at home say that it will affect economic growth if they abide by these policies. Furthermore, the developing nations have an incentive to say that they can't participate in this without financial and technical assistance from the developing world. So the EU has committed to between 2 and 15 billion a year to help the developing states on issues of climate change. So there are domestic and economic factors, and the way in which I think all states can kind of game the system so that they don't actually have to do very much. They've got domestic factors, they've got financial reasons, and so forth. And so I think it's a broad story that includes the psychological, but the others as well. I know we're running out of time, but I did want to say something in response to Steve Brockmann, if that's a possibility. Okay. Steve, you talked about that we can't create reality. But I do believe in a way the G system as it expands is creating a reality that doesn't truly exist. If you look at all of the communiques of these and other emerging groups like BRIC, they say that we're in a multipolar world. And I think they're conflating multipolarity and multilateralism. The fact that you have a lot of actors in an international institution doesn't mean that you have various poles of power. The United States still contributes the lion's share of military spending in the world. It is the single largest nation in terms of GDP after the EU. And China is third, but it's very far behind. And so it's not that there isn't a reality out there that still is around a very powerful United States that much of these of the international institutions are trying to deny the rhetoric that they're using. And so I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. We really are out of time now. As Karen said, words are cheap, and we're going to be hearing a lot of words in the next few days from our leaders, either individually or collectively. Action can be harder and certainly more expensive. I hope that our words here have been of some value to you, and that will have to be, I'm afraid, the last word. So thank you very much.